Hey guys, and welcome back to this tutorial series. In this video, we're going to build the administrative login and registration system, one of the most important features of our project. Before we start building the login form, however, we first need to create a couple of reusable files that our system will rely on. One of those files is to allow our system to connect to the database, and the other one is to protect pages that should only be accessed when someone is logged in. Let's first begin with the database connection file. Inside of our includes folder, we are going to create our first file. So I'm going to right click on includes and create a new file. I'm going to call this file dbconnect.php, and this is going to be our database connection file. So the first things that I'm going to put in are a few variables which are going to hold our database connection settings or credentials. So I'm going to create one called, I'm going to open my PHP tags first of all, can't forget that. And then I'm going to create a variable called host, and I'm going to create another one called user. I'm going to create another one called pass or password, and I'm going to create another one called dbname, which is going to be our database name. So let's populate these variables. Our host, of course, since I'm using Laragon locally, or you might be using XAMPP locally, then your host will usually be localhost. So in this case, I'm going to have my host as localhost, semicolon. My user is going to be the default user for PHP which is root. I currently do not have a password, so I am simply going to put in these blank inverted commas or these quotations. And then my database name, if you remember earlier, is called MediTrack. So these are our database connection credentials. Okay? The next thing I'm going to do is to create the actual variable or actual connection or key to my database, because we have to connect or pass these credentials to the database so that they can be checked. I'm going to put this in a variable called con, and we have a built-in PHP function or SQL function called MySQLi underscore connect. And this is going to hold the variables that I just created a while ago, because it's going to use those values and it's going to pass those values over to the database for checking. So the first one is host. The second one is user. The third one is class. And the fourth one is our DB name. Okay? Not forgetting our semicolon, that's very important. I'm going to save. Now, this can work as it is now, but we, as good developers, we always want to check whether our connection worked or whether our connection failed. So we're going to write a short statement that's going to check if the connection failed. And if it did, then the script is going to stop with a helpful error message. So I'm going to say if not con, meaning if the connection does not work, then we are going to kill the connection by saying die. And we're going to put a little string in here where we're going to say connection failed. And because we want to give helpful error messages, we're going to tap into another useful PHP built-in MySQLi function, which is MySQLi underscore connect underscore error. And this particular function is going to be able to pull up and to give us back what the actual error is, what actually went wrong. Okay, semicolon, and we're going to save this. So now we actually have a connection to our database that is going to allow our system to connect to the database. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to create a file called authcheck.php. And this authcheck.php, which is going to be inside our includes folder, auth underscore check.php, is going to make sure that only logged in users can view the admin pages. So if someone is not logged in and they simply go to the URL of our system, they will only be able to access the login page. They won't be able to access any of our patient pages, our visits pages, or any of the other pages that we're going to create. So let's go ahead and create that file authcheck.php. And let's go ahead and see what we need to put in that file in order for this file to perform its role. So the first thing we're going to do once again is we're going to open our PHP tags. And inside our PHP tags, we are going to start a session. So I'm going to say session start. Now, session start, as we know, is used to be able to collect our username, our login information from the user once they have logged in, and then it's going to allow us to access our session variables. Now, those session variables are very important. So session start is going to begin a session so that we can access session variables. And then now we're going to check if there is an admin logged in. And if there isn't an admin logged in, it's going to send the user back to the login page. This is our basic form of session-based access control. Okay, so let's go back and continue this. So in order to check if there is an admin logged in, we're going to say if, and we're going to use is set. So I'm going to say if not is set, meaning if something is not set. So if the session admin variable is not set, which means if a user who is an admin is not logged in, so I'm going to say session, I'm going to say admin, okay? So if this is not the case, then we're going to direct or redirect our user back to a particular location. And that particular location is going to be our login page, login.php. And I'm going to close my quotations here and get rid of the double one at the front here, semicolon. And of course, we always like to exit our programs when we write them. We don't want to leave them the possibility of running over and over forever. So we want to always tell it when it's done. So if there is a user if a user is not logged in, then everyone is going to be directed to this login.php page. Okay. Now that we have our database connection and our session protection set up, let us create the actual admin registration system. Now, in order to do this, we're going to need to create a new file in the root directory of our project called register.php. So when I say in the root directory of our project, it means it's not in your admin, CSS, or includes folder. It resides right here in the root of our project. So I'm going to create a file called register.php. And this file is going to be what we're going to use to actually register a new user into our database. Okay, so let's see what we need to include in this file. At the top, aside from our opening PHP tags, we also need to include some files or some things that we need. Now remember, this page is going to be connecting to our database. And in order to connect to our database, we need to require a file. And we're going to require our dbconnect.php. Why? Because our dbconnect.php is our database connection. So our file dbconnect.php is in our includes folder. So our location is going to be includes / and then we can select dbconnect from here, and we should not forget our semicolon. Now, in addition to that, I'm also going to initialize a variable called message. And in a while, you're going to see how that variable message comes in. That variable message is going to be used to provide useful messaging feedback for our user. So we'll be using that empty variable message that I just created as the area or the variable that's going to store useful messaging for our user in this register.php page. Now let's go ahead and build in the rest of our register.php. Now, one of the first things we always need to do is we need to check if the form was actually submitted. We don't want any of the PHP on this page to be run unless the form was actually submitted. So in order to ensure this, we're going to wrap everything that we're doing inside this line of code. So we're going to say if $_ silver, and we're going to say request method. So we're checking if the request method is post equal to post. Then if the page was accessed via post, meaning if it was actually submitted, then we can go ahead and execute whatever is inside of this statement, this if statement. So the things we now need to do, or what we now need to do, is to create the location where our users are going to register. And this is going to be done inside a form. Now, we currently do not have a form, so we're going to create our form. Now, I already have my form pre-built, so I am going to put in my boilerplate. I'm going to put in my boilerplate code, and inside of my boilerplate code, one of the first things also I have to do, since I have HTML on my page together with PHP, I need to ensure that my PHP tags are closed before my HTML. And I'm going to create this new page, and I'm going to give it a title of register new admin. And I'm also going to connect this page to my CSS that I already have and which you should have also already had and downloaded and put into your project. So I'm going to create a link here for my CSS, and I'm going to point it to my CSS file, which currently is called styles.tss, and it's also inside of a CSS folder. So that will give my page the necessary styles that we need. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get my form, which I have pre-built, and you can always pause the video in order for you to be able to go ahead and type this in and put this together. So I'm going to copy my form and I'm going to place my form inside the body of my HTML. And here it is. So you notice that my form method is post. You notice that I have a username input area, has an input type of text and name of username. We have an input area with an input type of password for the password and name attribute of password. We have a confirm password, which is always good when you're registering new users. And we have an input type of password again and a name of confirmed. All of these three fields are required. Okay. And finally, just going to, since I don't intend to have a main navigation for this system, I'm going to put in a link at the bottom here, which is a paragraph. And inside that paragraph, I'm also going to put in a link, which is an anchor, which is going to point to a file which we'll create later called login.php. Okay. And then I'm going to put in a link that says back, let's use a capital B, back to login. So this is back to login. So this is going to take our user back to the login screen, okay, if they are not registering, okay? So with that, let us now go ahead and let us go and build the engine that is going to take care of our user registration. And it's not very long. We're simply going to access the inputs from the form and we're going to compare these inputs from the form. We're going to put these inputs from the form into our database. So let's go through these steps. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create variables that are going to store the inputs from the form. So username for collecting the username. We're also going to have password for collecting the password. And of course, the user is also putting a confirmation. So I'm going to create one called confirm. Now, username can quite simply be equal to um, can be quite simply equal to our post superglobal since our form is using post. So it can be post and I can put in the name of the field, which is username. It can also, we can also have password being equal to our same underscore post and post password. And we can also have our confirm being equal to our $ underscore post, and it will be equal to confirm. And that in itself would be well and good. Okay, that in itself would be well and good. But there's still a little safety that we need to put in place. Now, when we're putting in or when we're collecting inputs for our registration, one of the things we want to do is you want to prevent something called SQL injection. So what in itself is SQL injection? SQL injection means that someone can actually go into our form and type SQL statements or dangerous SQL statements into our form to be able to change certain things within our SQL database. So, for instance, they may type in SQL code to say drop table admins or drop table patients, and the entire table can get deleted. So, in order to actually protect ourselves from this, we are going to make a small change to our username input where we're going to sanitize whatever was put into our username input so that the information that is put inside of there that cannot be accepted or won't be accepted if it has any sort of resemblance to SQL statements or SQL code. So let's go ahead and do that. So in order to do that, and let me fix a little typo here. I have password with a P in the middle, so I'm going to fix that. So what we're going to do is we're going to wrap this entire post superglobal in our protection, our SQL injection protection, which is my SQLI underscore real underscore escape underscore string. And we're going to wrap this entire thing in this. Okay. And then there's still a couple more variables that, not variables, but a couple more values that we need to put in. So one of the first things we're going to do is because we're escaping uh, characters that resemble SQL statements, okay, and converting them into pure string, which is what this does. We also need to give this statement the ability to connect to our database, and that is typically done through our con or our variable con. Also, something else that we can do just as good developers is that we know sometimes when people are putting in usernames or when they're putting in usernames, sometimes they may copy and paste. Sometimes as an error, they may add extra spaces in some of the things that they type. So one of the things we can also do is that we can use a particular little function called trim. And what trim does is that it actually removes any extra spaces just in case the user typed a space, an extra space at the start or at the end of whatever it is that they typed. Okay? So pay attention to your parentheses. Make sure that they're matched and closed. Don't have any parentheses that you opened and forgot to close. Okay? And then now we can proceed. Now you may be wondering, of course, why we didn't do the MySQLi real escape string protection for SQL injection to our password as well. Well, that is because we're going to be doing something to our password that's collected from our form. We are going to be hashing the password. We're not going to be inserting the password directly into SQL. We're first going to hash the password. And hashing the password means encrypting our password, which is going to make our password safe. So now that we've collected the information from the form, the next thing we have to do is that we're going to see if we can put our information into our form. So first and foremost, I'm going to make sure that the user did not leave any fields blank. And if they did leave any fields blank, okay, we want to give them, again, useful messaging. So I'm going to say if, And this might be a little lengthy, but I will say if empty username, okay, then I'm going to say or, which is our double pipe symbol, empty password, and I'm going to go in and put in another double pipe symbol, or empty confirm, then something is going to happen. So if any of these are empty, then something is going to happen. And that something is going to be that they're going to get a message that all the fields are required. Now, earlier on, I created this variable called message. And you may be thinking to yourself, well, we didn't really need to create a message variable just to give them an error message. But if at any point I would have wanted to style that message or to make that message a little, a little prettier, and I needed to style it, the only way that I would have been able to style it is if it was in some form of HTML. Now, as you know, I could have echoed this out, okay? But I would have liked at some point to repeat this message or to use a different message, right, at certain points. And I really didn't want to just basically have this message being just echoed out. So I put it inside a message variable. So here in my message variable, I'm going to have it to store, okay? I'm going to have it to store because we're not outputting it yet. We're simply putting the message into the variable. So I'm going to have it to store this message, and the message is going to be some HTML, which is going to be a paragraph, which is going to have a class equal to error. And I'm sure you know why we're doing this right now. We're going to have a class which is equal to error. Okay, I have to use single quotes because I'm using double quotes already. And then I'm going to close my first angular bracket. I'm going to open my closing angular bracket, and I'm going to close it. And what's going to be inside of this paragraph is going to be the text. All fields are required. So all fields are required is being stored in my message variable. And that's going to be outputted later on. So what happens if this is not the case? So this, it's not empty. We've gone past this, okay? So if it's empty, it goes here. But if it's not empty, then what happens? Then the user can proceed. Else, if the password that the user enters, so that would be password, is not equal to the confirmed password, as we have experienced before on various websites, then something has to happen. Then we have another sequence where we're putting another message into our message variable. I'm going to copy and paste it here, and I'm simply going to change the message, and it says passwords do not match. Okay, I think that should do the trick. Okay, passwords do not match. In any other circumstance where the usernames are not empty, the passwords, the usernames, and confirm are not empty, and also the password and the confirmation password or the confirmed password match, then in that circumstance, we can now go on to the rest of what needs to be done. Now remember, I spoke about hashing our password. So I'm going to say else I am going to hash my password. Now I'm going to store my hashed password or my encrypted password in a variable called hash. And in order to hash my password, I'm going to use a PHP PHP function called password hash, which is going to store, we're going to take in two values. Okay. First of all, password hash is going to take our user's password and it's going to turn it into a scrambled or encrypted string that's going to be very hard to reverse. So one of the first values that goes in is the user's password, comma, and the second value that's going to use is that we're going to put in is going to be password default. And we're using password default here. And this statement, this line, actually gives us the latest encryption that we can use for our project, the latest password encryption that we can use for our project. So we're on track. So what is next? So now that we have a username, now that we have a password, and that password gets hashed, the next thing we have to do once everything is fine is that we need to write an SQL statement that's going to pass all of this into our database and then pass it into our database. So I'm going to say, or create rather, a variable called SQL. And I'm going to use that variable to store the full SQL statement that's going to be passed onto our database. So I'm going to say insert into admins. And what are we inserting into admin? We're inserting username. Now, the values that go in here, okay, go into our admins table. And in our admins table, we are putting in a username and a password. Okay, now these are supposed to match the column names in our database. So if I go into my database, into the admins table, you would see that I have a username and a password field. Notice that we're not putting in any ID, and that automatically tells you that this table is using an auto-incremented ID. So which is why we're not putting that information in. So let's go back to our code. Then we need to specify the values that we want to put in. And the values that we want to put in are the user inputted username, which is stored in username. And then we want to put in the password. Now, currently, the password is hashed, and the hashed password is stored in hashed. So what we're actually going to put in here is hashed. Okay, then we close our parentheses and then we put in our semicolon. So this is our SQL statement, and our SQL statement is now being stored inside of our SQL variable. So now that we've done that, we now need to pass this SQL statement to our database. And should it succeed, we need to tell the user. Should it not succeed, we need to tell the user. So I'm going to say and realize that we are going into familiar territory. We're going to say if, okay, something happens, okay, then we're going to do something, and else we're going to do something else. Okay, so let's go ahead and fill that in. So if the actual sending of the information into our database is successful. And how do we do that? We say my SQLi underscore query. And then we know that we're going to be passing our database connection. And we're also going to be passing our SQL statement, which is now stored in SQL, because we don't want to write this whole statement again. That's why we put it in a variable. Then, if that happens successfully, then the user is going to get, guess what? Message or a message. And inside that message, we're going to create another paragraph. So I'm going to say, open my paragraph tags, close my paragraph tags. I have a little error here. Whoops. And then I'm going to give this paragraph a class. Why am I giving it a class? Because in my CSS, I am actually styling this as success. And then now, inside of my paragraph, I'm going to put what I want the user to see. And it's going to say registration successful. But let's go one step further. In addition to saying registration successful, I also want them to log in. I want to give them the option, as you've seen in many websites, that once you've successfully registered, it takes you to log in. So I'm going to put a link in here. I'm going to put an anchor tag, okay? And I'm also going to close it as well. And inside that anchor tag, I'm going to put in the href, the actual link. And that href is going to be equal to login.php. Now, we haven't created login.php as yet, but we will soon. And the text for that link is going to be login now. And we're going to save this. So this is what happens if the statement, our SQL statement, is sent in and is successfully validated. Let us look at what happens if it's not successfully validated. Okay, and I'm going to copy this simply because we already have a paragraph tag in here, and I would like to be a little bit lazy, and I'm going to paste this here. And in my paragraph, I'm going to give this a class of error. And the error is going to be, let's take all of this out, and it's going to be that username might already exist. That is the only thing that might be the issue in this case that we have not handled. That username might already exist. Exclamation mark. Okay, so I shouldn't forget my semicolon. And I also should not forget my semicolon here. Okay, so now we have an engine that works for our system. We have an engine that works for our registration system.